So something that teachers just know and often say to each other is that teaching is hard. It's very difficult to explain what makes teaching hard. And especially if you're a new or a prospective teacher, this might be helpful to you. One of the reasons why it's so hard to pinpoint what makes teaching hard is because difficult or level of challenge is kind of relative. It depends on what you bring to the table, your own skills that you're bringing to teaching, your own mindsets and attitude that you're bringing to teaching, what type of school or under what kind of leadership you end up teaching. All of these things make teaching hard or easy. Well, not easy, but less hard. If you haven't heard the following yet, I'm sure you'll hear it at some point in your career. The question whether teaching is an art or a science. The art side of teaching emphasizes things that are less observable, while the science side of things emphasizes more of the things that are observable. And then there are people like myself who think it's a bit of both. And a lot of people, I think, feel is both an art and a science. But the depth of the level that this debate gets to, it's so big that we have graduate schools and programs that more so focus on the art side of things and some that focus more exclusively on the craft side of things. But all that is to say, this is what makes teaching hard to explain and describe. But regardless of which side you're on, there are some things that both sides agree on that are challenging about teaching. Something that's hard about teaching is planning. Lesson planning is hard, but teachers do all types of planning. They have to plan how students will enter the room, how they will leave the room, what kind of systems they need to have for students wanting to leave the room, for bathrooms and nurses and the main office. In many situations, teachers are given a curriculum to follow, but a lot of times teachers have to plan how they'll deliver that curriculum, what changes they might make for different students, which leads me to the second big challenge that all teachers, I would think, agree on is differentiating instruction or adapting or modifying or accommodating instruction for particular students based on their individual needs. This is the thing that teachers are always asked to do, but it wouldn't be entirely accurate if we said that it was easy. I think with the advent of technology and educational technology in particular, it has gotten easier, but to tailor the content of your lesson for different groups of students or individual students is something that just never gets easier. And it remains novel because by definition, if you're individualizing instruction, every year you get new students, different students. Every class has different individuals with different personalities, different interests. So you can never have a template that you just apply every year. So in some aspects of teaching, you can use the same stuff every year, some systems you've built over the years, some routines you've done over the years that work really well. But when it comes to differentiation, it's something that has to change. Now, it happens that sometimes general differentiation strategies are often helpful and don't require a lot of work to individualize for each student. But there are still so many ways you can make something more accessible for a student and reduce more barriers for individual students. And it just happens to be one of those things that you can just never perfectly do. There's always room for improvement. And that's also true for planning in general. Even when you're planning lessons, even when lessons are given to you and you have to make tweaks to them, there's just no such thing as a perfect lesson. Every teacher will tell you, no matter how good it felt while doing it, no matter how well it went, there's always, upon reflection, things that you can do to make it even better. And although personally, that's one of the things I love about teaching, the planning aspect of it and the revision and the feedback aspect of it. But I know for a lot of people, it's a cause of anxiety and it's very difficult to keep up with day after day, week after week for an entire year. While we're talking about planning and differentiation and making things for students to do, grading and feedback is one of the hardest things. You would think, if you think of a teacher as often we're portrayed in like the media, teachers are always grading and just putting A's and B's and F's and F minuses even on people's papers. But that's really a caricature of what really goes on, because grading is really not that simple. Grading is difficult for two reasons. One, just the sheer load of grading. If you choose to grade every single thing, there's a lot you can be grading. And many teachers have a load of 120 to 150 students, and collecting all of that work and grading all of it and reading all of it and adding feedback and comments to all of it, that's really hard to do. And it's something that we all fall behind on all the time. So until you have a really good understanding of what grading means to you, what is its purpose, what is worth grading and what is not, and how often will you grade, how will you grade, what kind of rubrics will you use, what kind of grading system will you use, unless your school already has one. In that case, you might not even have a choice. So all of these factors combined just make grading and feedback on student tasks, student work, a thing that's very challenging. And I suspect grading is one of the reasons why we sometimes hear our teachers' work is never done, because literally it is never done. Now, the next thing that can be very challenging for a lot of teachers is just simple classroom management. Depending on the number of students you have in your room, depending on their individual needs, their dispositions, their personalities, their previous schooling experience, the overall structure of the school, or how supported they feel, classroom management can be a real challenge. When you have so many students in a room with one teacher, there is a lot that you don't see. And kids of all ages do things that kids do. And sometimes those things can be harder to deal with or manage than others. So having good classroom management is obviously a really big fundamental of teaching that you have to possess and perfect as quickly as you can. But on the positive note, this is one of those things that comes to most teachers over time, and it does get better. And it's definitely one of the things that makes teaching challenging. One other thing that makes teaching particularly challenging is that teachers often get observed, sometimes by peers, but often by administrators, and sometimes even the supervisors of the administrators, like superintendents. And no matter how experienced you get or how good you are, there's still a little bit of nervousness that brings, because there are a few different professions where people are watched and judged. We know actors, comedians, live performers of any kind, but teaching's a little bit different, because in teaching, a lot of times you know when you're being observed, but sometimes you don't know when you're being observed. And sometimes you're being observed informally. Your principal just wants to pop in, see how things are going, give you some quick feedback, and head out. At other times, it's a formal observation with a meeting before the observation, a meeting after the observation, and it can be a lot for a lot of people. However, it is great, and many principals are like this, that they are very supportive in observing you, and they try their best to relieve you of all the stress, and they do their best to always find something positive to share with you. And if they're highly skilled, they try to give you that critical feedback in a way that feels authentic, reasonable, and something that they got you to generate yourself. The next thing that can be challenging about teaching is parent outreach and communication and relationships in general. That's a really hard thing to do, because you want to have a constant communication with parents, but parents are also very busy. Many have multiple jobs. Many have a single parent household, several children to take care of. So establishing that constant connection can be difficult, but it can also be difficult on the teacher's side to make that outreach attempt, because even though many teachers are given some time in their schedule once a week or so to make that parent outreach, but one phone call can sometimes take just 15-20 minutes. So getting a chance to speak with all, let's say, 120 parents is really difficult. And it's also great when you can have positive conversations with parents, but it gets challenging when you have to have a conversation about things that are not going very well. I have personally never had parents who are extremely defensive to any kind of feedback that I'm sharing with them, but I have seen parents and heard from many of my colleagues that many of those conversations with parents become very difficult. The point is that managing this relationship can be very challenging, both because of time constraints, but also because sometimes you have to communicate things that are hard for you to share and also hard for the parents to hear. And last but not least, one thing that makes teaching really challenging is the constantly changing education landscape. One year we're focusing on test scores, the next year we're focusing on teacher evaluations, the next year we're focusing on vocabulary, the next year we're focusing on turn and talks, the next year we're focusing on deeper discussions, the next year we're focusing on Socratic seminars, the next year we're focusing on interdisciplinary connections, the next year we're focusing on project-based learning, the next year we're focusing you could just go on and on and on. And to be honest with you, every year is maybe being too generous. Sometimes it happens every few months. Teachers are just never left alone to do their work and develop at their own pace professionally and personally. In so many places, it just becomes a kind of business where you have to have a new flavor of the month. And I know I have heard many principals say this, oh, it's the new flavor of the month from the higher ups that's trickling down, whether it's explicit instruction or universal design for learning or data driven instruction. And the funniest thing is, if you've been in the profession long enough, you'll actually start to see things branded and rebranded again. It's the same thing being called one thing, and the next year is being called something else. And some brilliant person has found a nuance that warrants the rebranding of the thing. So then they rebrand it. And now we have a new set of professional development sessions, tools and trackers and resources that we are supposed to use. And it just never ends. And that makes teaching so challenging because you just can't focus. Your attention is diverted and directed. There's so many things already that your attention is spread thin on. And in addition to that, constantly there's a flow of new information coming and new things coming that aren't really new, but we have to constantly rejigger them up and rename them and call them something else and redefine them. And that is exhausting for a lot of people who are already struggling just to keep up with the workload, the work-life balance. And I haven't even mentioned anything about the emotional cost of the profession. There's so many relationships you're trying to navigate and build and sustain. There's so much love and affection you're trying to give. There's so many young people you're trying to inspire and motivate. And all of that requires so much of your emotional skills and intelligence that alone is already cognitively and physically draining for people. But if you're a new teacher, one thing I will share from experience is that there is hardly anything new in teaching. And very rarely do we get some brand new, groundbreaking type of an idea that hadn't been considered before. But more on PD in another video. I wanted to share what makes teaching difficult because a lot of people don't seem to have an appreciation for the complexity of the job, of the day-to-day work. How teachers are portrayed in the media especially doesn't seem to show that we're doing a lot of hard work and there's literally no time to even go to the bathroom. Like, you don't see that aspect of teaching very frequently on TV. But it's important to name because I think it really helps us appreciate how challenging the work is. And I know this is why many teachers also just love this work so much, because it is so intense all of the time. It just keeps you going. And like they say, there's never a dull moment. And I'm sure I missed a bunch of other things that make teaching challenging. So if you got some ideas, share them in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.